everybody. I'm Claudia Lieb. I'm Associate Professor of Political Theory. And it's my pleasure to introduce Amy Allen today. Amy Allen, she is a liberal arts professor of philosophy, women's gender and sexuality studies at Penn State University. She's also the department head. She was a philosophy professor at Dartmouth College before coming to Penn State. She was also the head of the department there, and she was there between 1997 and 2015. She got her PhD at Northwestern University in 1996. She also has an MA in philosophy from Northwestern and a BA in philosophy from Miami University. So her areas of specialization are 20th century continental philosophy, critical social theory, feminist theory, social and political theory. Amy, she's very well published, several books. Her most recent one is Critical Theory Between Klein and Lacan, a dialogue with Mary Ruti, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2019. And she also has another recent book, The End of Progress, Decolonizing the Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, that came out with Columbia University Press in 2016. And the book, I understand, has just been translated into German, so that's very exciting. She has also published articles in several journals, including Hypatia, Constellations, Political Theory, Journal of Theoretical Humanities, and Critical Horizons. And she's also the New Critical Theory series editor at Columbia University Press. And she's working right now on a new book called The Force of Reason, Psychoanalysis and Critical Theory. And that's actually the conclusion of that book. So she just finished that book, which is great. And I also wanted to just tell you a little bit how Amy came here. As Cornell mentioned, I'm working with her, and I wanted to thank Masha Gastein, who's sitting over there. She's actually the director of the Advanced External Mentor Grant Program, and I got that mentor grant to be working with Amy. We are basically reading drafts of our chapters of our new books and supporting each other, and that has been a wonderful opportunity. So thank you very much. Thank you. Please welcome Amy.
Okay, thanks so much. A few thank yous first to Cornell Clayton and the Foley Institute for having me back. I spoke here 2 years ago, so it's nice to be back here again. And to Masha Gardstein also, and the advanced program for the grant that facilitated this, and to Claudia Lieb for helping to organize everything. So a couple caveats before I start. As is hopefully clear from Claudia's introduction, I'm a philosopher, not a public policy expert. Much of my work is very abstract and theoretical. I'm going to try to talk about how I think some of it could have implications for diagnosing and analyzing our contemporary politics, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion with people who are more steeped in policy kinds of questions and debates. Also, wow, what an impressive lineup of speakers you have coming up. You know, sometimes they talk about being a tough act to follow. I feel like this is a tough act to precede. I'm not a New York Times bestselling author or a world famous political scientist, so in any case, I'll do my best. What else can I say to lower your expectations for this? I think that's probably it. So Claudia made clear a lot of my work is in critical theory, particularly in the tradition of the Frankfurt School. So I'm mainly working with figures like Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Jürgen Habermas, and so on. What I find really compelling about that project is its distinctive methodological approach, which I would say is somewhere right in between kind of empirical political science and normative political philosophy. So the idea is to try to draw on somehow a realistic understanding of our actually existing society to develop a normative critique of it. So it's got this kind of two-pronged approach. Now the psychoanalysis has, for a long time, been very important for the tradition of Frankfurt School critical theory. In fact, the early Frankfurt School first turned to psychoanalysis as a way of supplementing their Marxist analysis of society. So basically, the turn to psychoanalysis happened in the wake of the failure of the workers' revolutions in Germany and the emergence of fascism in their wake. And basically, the early members of the Frankfurt School thought that this, my first slide actually, that this, it made no sense from a traditional Marxist perspective, and that they needed some kind of social psychology or psychological theory to try to understand the failure of the workers' movement, and then why the workers eventually supported fascism, and also the barbarism and horror of the Holocaust. So the Institute for Social Research, which is the institutional home of what later became known as the Frankfurt School, actually began its life as a Marxist reading group, the members of which all came together trying to comprehend the defeat of the revolutionary aspirations of the German workers after World War I, and the resulting splintering of the left in Germany between communists and social democrats. And the Frankfurt School, as many of you probably know, later rose to prominence on the strength of its attempt to grapple with the catastrophic rise of European fascism, a rise that was facilitated in part with the support of the German workers. So why psychoanalysis, you might say? Well, at the time, of course, that it was the prevailing psychological theory. This is no longer the case for us, and so we could have a discussion about why one would turn to psychoanalysis as opposed to other kinds of social psychology. And I'm happy to talk about that. I'm not going to defend my turn to psychoanalysis in this talk, because that's not my main focus, but I would say, at least an initial reason, is that psychoanalysis offered and still offers a very well developed theory of irrationality that is what critical theory found so useful in that body of work. And so now we're in a situation where there's a resurgence, as you all know, of authoritarian populist politics around the world, and that resurgence, particularly in the United States, in Europe, has left a lot of critical theorists scrambling for explanations and trying to understand what's going on. So it seems clear to me that any sufficient analysis of this phenomenon would have to take into account the global financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath. But I think there's also a kind of sense among critical theorists that economic account by itself is not sufficient. So the emergence of Trumpism, of Brexit, of the Alternative for Deutschland, Marine Le Pen, and so on, in the context of relatively stable, still on the whole prosperous liberal democracies, seems so irrational and so tied to a politics of anger, of resentment, violence, xenophobic hatred, and even a kind of destructive willingness to drive Euro-Atlantic democracy off a cliff, that many critical theorists have thought we need to turn to psychoanalysis again for resources to understand what's going on here, and also to think about how we might move forward. So I'm, kind of working with that group of theorists, or in that vein. But I think there's a danger here, maybe more than one, but one particular danger that I want to focus on here of turning to psychoanalysis to diagnose current political events. And the danger is that it can sometimes lead to a tendency to pathologize people with whom we disagree. So, for example, when I think progressive critics identify phenomena such as Trumpism or Brexit with regressive psychological states, or identify the people who support Trumpism or Brexit as having authoritarian personality structures, which is something that you've seen emerge a lot in the wake of the rise of Trump. A bunch of articles about how the Frankfurt School was right in their analysis of the authoritarian personality and so on, and we should go back to that analysis. But I think there's a danger there in pathologizing people that we disagree with. And the implicit effect of that kind of approach can be to position the critic or the critical theorist as somehow psychologically more mature than his or her opponents. And I think that can be sometimes a satisfying sort of stance for critical theorists to take, but I also think it's a dangerous one, and that we should be really careful about the seductions of that stance and those satisfactions. I'm not going to go into it, but I think one of the theorists whose work I really admire and I think is really important and very astute So there's a tendency of some of this in some of Wendy Brown's recent work, where she draws on psychoanalysis to analyze the kind of contemporary state and the emergence of authoritarian politics in what she calls the ruins of neoliberalism. And as I said, I agree with a lot of the analysis, but I worry a little bit about this kind of tendency that I see there and in some of this other work to pathologize political opponents. So, so I think we want to be careful about positioning ourselves, let's say critical theorists or critics of right-wing and authoritarian movements, as somehow more autonomous, mature, or enlightened than the kind of heteronymous, regressive, and easily manipulated followers of right-wing populist movements. Not least because I think it's an awareness that many left critical theory types, intellectuals and academics, think that people who support right-wing populist movements are backward and regressive is part of what fuels the hatred of elites that supports authoritarian politics. So I think it's not just that we want to be a little more self-critical about our own stance, but also that it's politically counterproductive to kind of take this pathologizing stance toward people with whom we disagree politically. And I have a quote here from Nancy Fraser, a critical theorist, who just published a book called Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, where I think she makes this point really well. So she's talking about the dismissive response to members or supporters of right-wing populist movements, and she says, the dismissive response is wrong, and I would add counterproductive. Right-wing populists do have genuine grievances which deserve to be validated, and reactionary populist movements are responding to a real underlying crisis, which also requires acknowledgement. So for me, the really hard question is to think about how to avoid this kind of tendency to pathologization, but without, of course, making too many excuses for people who hold political views that are, in some sense, we think problematic, racist, or white supremacist, or whatever. Okay, so, and how to draw on psychoanalysis in a way that doesn't fall into this trap. As Claudia mentioned, the book that I've just finished writing, or I'm finishing writing, is really largely a kind of theoretical consideration of the resources that one can find in psychoanalysis for contemporary critical theory. And it focuses mainly on questions about theories of subjectivity and conceptions of historical progress and change and prospects for emancipation and so on. So it's a more abstract discussion. But in the conclusion, and this presentation is drawn from the conclusion to the book, I'm trying to think about some implications for contemporary politics. And I want to do that through the example of thinking about conspiracy theories. So I'm not an expert on conspiracy theories. The book is not about conspiracy theories, but I do think that there's some aspects of the psychoanalytic theory that I'm trying to draw on that are pretty illuminating, or to me, insightful and interesting, in thinking about the logics of certain conspiracy theories, and maybe also giving us a way of thinking about how to politically respond to conspiracy theories. So that's kind of where I'm heading. So if, just to go back to the slides, if Fraser is right, then I think what we need, what critical theorists need, is a kind of psychoanalytic framework that can help us to understand, in some way, the irrationality that seems to be fueling a lot of these political movements, without falling into a kind of problematic form of pathologization. And so how can we do that? I mean, the challenge is, and I think Fraser again puts it well in this passage, is how to think about the deepening divisions, even hatreds, long simmering but recently raised to a fever pitch by Trump, which appear to validate the view held by some progressives that all Trump voters are deplorables, irredeemable racists, misogynists, and homophobes. Also reinforces the converse view held by many reactionary populists that all progressives are incorrigible moralizers and smug elites who look down on them while sipping lattes and raking in the bucks. So part of the challenge is then to understand sort of what's happening in politics, but also to just understand the extreme forms of polarization and how we might begin to work through and past them. So what I want to suggest in the remainder of the talk is that we can find some helpful resources for these questions in the work of the psychoanalytic theorist Melanie Klein. So, for those of you who don't know anything about Klein, she was a younger contemporary of Freud. She was an early pioneer in doing psychoanalytic work with children, and that gave her, I think, a different kind of insight into thinking about early infant development and the development of subjectivity in early infancy than previous psychoanalytic theorists had. She was a founder of what's now called object relations theory, and so more relational approaches to psychoanalysis, and was also one of the most prominent post-Freudian analysts, particularly in the United Kingdom. She was originally based in Berlin and then moved to London. I forget exactly when, in the early 30s, I think, and became very influential there in the British Psychoanalytic Society. And so has a kind of important role in the history, not just of psychoanalysis, but also of psychoanalytically informed social theory and forms of therapy in the United Kingdom. Okay, so I have to go over some key Kleinian concepts in order to say what I want to say about conspiracy theories. And I know this is going to sound like weird, but just bear with me, because I do think there's a payoff to going through some of this terminology. So Klein's main distinction is between what she calls these two positions, the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. Basically, she's trying to offer a framework for thinking about the stages that infants go through in the first year of life. And she's thinking about, basically how the ego and the self is formed in its relationships to its primary caregivers. So rather than, and here I think could be an advantage of Klein's view, depending on your view on all this. If you're familiar with some psychoanalytic theory, particularly Freud, and his whole theory of Oedipal development, psychosexual development, right? Klein is not talking about any of that. She's actually talking about stuff that happens before any of that process of Oedipal psychosexual development. She's talking about much more, you might even say, archaic or primordial kinds of anxieties and struggles that selves have of trying to kind of hold themselves together as coherent selves without sort of falling into pieces. So it's basically that kind of difficult negotiation that she's interested in. And you don't have to, she did accept Freud's theory of psychosexual development, but you don't have to believe any of it in order to kind of endorse something like this view. I see that as an advantage because I see a lot of problems with this story about Oedipalization, particularly from a feminist point of view. But so I'll just mention that as a distinctive feature of Klein's view. Okay, so for Klein, we all start out life in what she calls the paranoid schizoid position. So it's called paranoid because it's marked by a high degree of persecutory anxiety. So we feel as if we're being attacked from without. And I think the idea here is sort of like, as for a young infant, like, experience is really chaotic. It's hard for the infant to understand what's going on, and so things are perceived as threatening coming from the outside. And also, infants are born in a state of extreme dependence on caregivers who they experience as all-powerful. So the caregiver comes and goes, and the infant has no control over them or even an understanding of when they're coming back. And so it's this feeling of extreme anxiety that they're being kind of abandoned or even threatened by the lack of attention sometimes. And for Klein also, we start out with a relatively incoherent but still kind of rudimentary ego. So it's fragmented, but there's some sense of self that we have from the beginning. Because that sense of self is fragmentary and incoherent, the infant in the paranoid schizoid position engages in this process of what she calls splitting. So they split their primary objects into the good and bad object. The primary object is just the primary caregiver, usually the mother on Klein's view, but it doesn't have to be the biological mother. And so there's a kind of experience of the object as either all good and all powerful and all nourishing, or when the caregiver's not there, as persecutory, threatening, devouring, all hateful, destructive, and so on. Okay, so the paranoid schizoid position then is marked by these fears of persecution and being destroyed. That's the paranoid part. And by this polarizing logic of idealization and demonization. That's the schizoid part. It's split. Okay. What she calls the depressive position, by contrast, when the infant moves into that, they're able to have a more integrated experience of self. They can overcome the tendency towards splitting and have a more acceptance of ambivalence, that, you know, that their primary object, their primary caregiver, let's say, is not all good and wonderful when she's paying attention to them and horrible when she's not, but it's just one person who has good and bad sides, or that they have a kind of loving and also loving relationship with, and also quite a lot of anger. So there's like this acceptance of ambivalence and complexity and in the depressive position. Maybe that's enough for that for now. I can answer questions about it if there are questions, which I'm sure there probably are. Now, one thing to note about this is that these, for Klein, are what she calls positions, not developmental stages. So the idea is that all people kind of oscillate back and forth between these two positions at different points in their lives. Like for her, the depressive position is kind of an achievement. So it represents a kind of maturity and an ability to have a more stable sense of self and relation and more mature relation to objects. But it's not like you kind of achieve that and you are fine, right? Everybody is, on her view, vulnerable to falling back into the paranoid schizoid position, especially under periods of extreme stress and anxiety. And I think there's something of this in a kind of everyday understanding that, like, under periods of extreme stress and anxiety, we all have a tendency to fall apart, right? There's this sort of her idea, like to kind of become more fragmented and less coherent. And then also to engage in a kind of, people are either all good or they're all bad. They're either with me or against me. It's this kind of really extreme logic of splitting. That person that I was deeply in love with was wonderful, but now we're broken up and they're horrible. You do that kind of switch, right? That's the kind of paranoid schizoid logic for her that kind of comes out in periods of anxiety and stress. And I think this is key to why, at least this is part of my idea, that this is why this language is, I think, less pathologizing, because she's not, right? There is a kind of story of development here, but it's also like these are positions that everybody oscillates back and forth between. So it's not, by characterizing a political, let's say, position as paranoid schizoid, even though it doesn't sound like a compliment, it's not saying, this person is like regressive or like has an authoritarian personality structure and is therefore somehow pathologized. At least that's my intuition. Now, that said, I'm already starting to kind of make the connection to the politics, and maybe it's already a little clear what the connection's going to be, but I think the point of this is not to say that we would want to like diagnose individuals or groups or political movements as being somehow stuck in a paranoid schizoid position. I don't think that the point of drawing on psychoanalysis for thinking about politics is like that we can diagnose individual people, or political actors as like, but it's more about that the Klein gives us a language for talking about certain features of our contemporary politics that I think captures some of the features of them pretty well. Like there's pretty interesting insight there. And also maybe gives us some ideas about how we might try to overcome them. Okay, so with that, I want to talk about a couple of problems that I think Klein's work maybe helps us to recognize or gives us a language for talking about. Ways in which I think we could say that our politics operates in a paranoid schizoid mode at the moment, or has a tendency to. So first of all, there are high rates of persecutory anxiety. So for example, fears of being left behind by globalization, being overtaken by immigrant populations or something like this. I think this is where I would say that obviously the global financial crisis is a huge part of like how we got to where we are, because it creates extreme anxiety and instability that then kind of can easily be manipulated and turned into a kind of persecutory anxiety, like, oh, the fault is globalists, or the fault is immigrants, or the fault is something else, right? So there's some kind of sense of being attacked. Obviously, we also have, this is not news, extreme rates of political disintegration, partisanship, and polarization. So that relatively recent Pew study suggests that the rates of political polarization in the US right now, it's the study cited, are the highest they've been in 20 years or something like that. And I think one can think about that as a kind of schizoid feature of our politics, right? That there's a high degree of splitting and polarization. And then related to that is what Noel McAfee, who's a critical theorist who also works a lot with psychoanalysis, calls political Manichaeanism. So extreme demonization of opponents and also an extreme idealization of power. So the Kleinian insight then is that the higher the level of persecutory anxiety, and I think this is something that some right-wing authoritarian populist leaders have been very skillful in exploiting, the more disintegration and the more splitting will be likely to occur. So, as I said, the paranoid schizoid position for her is not a regressive or immature stage of development. It's a kind of way of relating to oneself and and other people, basically, that individuals fall into, especially under periods of extreme stress and anxiety. So the idea is then that at the political level, right-wing populist leaders have become very skillful at exploiting and reinforcing anxiety and intensifying persecutory anxiety by playing on fears of immigrants, let's say, or worries about economic globalization. And this leads to a kind of political splitting, whereby the immigrants and the politicians who support them are demonized and those who are going to defend us against them are idealized. And I think, and this is where I want to turn to conspiracy theories, that it makes a perfect sense on this kind of analysis that people would be more likely to accept and endorse conspiracy theories under this kind of condition, because those conspiracy theories are also marked, I think, by what we could call kind of paranoid schizoid logic. So the more powerless and anxious one feels, the more likely one would be to harbor persecutory anxieties or to feel oneself under attack from kind of shadowy, nefarious forces. And in that sense, it wouldn't at all be a surprise to see persecutory fantasies on the rise in a moment when, for example, the ability to practice democratic politics is being undermined and hollowed out by neoliberalism, and also to see conspiracy theories gain more traction among communities that are particularly politically disenfranchised or where people feel like they're politically disenfranchised. And that, I think, is an insight, which is regardless of whether their party is in power. And that's an insight from some of the empirical work in political science on conspiracy theories, for example, by Joseph Ushinsky, who wrote an interesting paper called Conspiracy Theories Are for Losers, arguing that it's people who are out of power and who feel, in that sense, disenfranchised, who are more likely to accept conspiracy theories. And that would explain, I think, why, although, of course, conspiracy theories have a long history and there have been right-wing and left-wing versions of conspiracy theories, at the moment, at least it seems to me, I haven't done empirical research on this, that the most kind of prominent conspiracy theories are emerging from the right. Even though, Republicans control the Senate and the presidency, that there's a feeling of embattledness or feeling of being disenfranchised that's fueling the rise of conspiracy theories. Okay, so I think we can see in conspiracy theories also what we might call in Kleinian in terms of kind of schizoid logic, characterized by an extreme demonization of opponents. And there are some interesting examples from this in Alex Jones, who, of course, runs the site InfoWars and has promoted a number of conspiracy theories. I mean, maybe most infamously, the Sandy Hook denial theory, for which he has been sued. And that has resulted in some curtailing of his platform, let's say. But I think there's some passages that are really striking that kind of exemplify this logic of demonization really perfectly. So, for example, Jones once described Hillary Clinton, and here's the quote, as an abject, psychopathic demon from hell. I don't know that you get any more clearly demonizing statement than that. That as soon as she gets into power is going to destroy the planet. And he also claimed that he makes a weird claim that Barack Obama, that if you look at video of Obama, that there are often flies on him when there are no flies anywhere else in the room, and I guess the implication is supposed to be that he's somehow rotten, like actually. And then related to that, that both Clinton and Obama smell like sulfur, they smell like hell. So that's, I mean, an extreme example, but I think given Alex Jones's influence, it's an important one of this kind of extreme demonization that is part of the logic of the conspiracy theory. The flip side of that then is an interesting kind of idealization. I mean, so there's a couple kinds of idealization that go on. One is this sort of, you know, my side is great, our ideas are wonderful, you know, the opponent is the demon, the demonization, right? That's a kind of splitting that happens. But there's another kind of more complicated idealization that I think fuels the logic of conspiracy theories that is also, can be understood in kind of Kleinian terms. And that's a kind of idealization of power. And the idea is that idealization of power is the flip side of persecutory anxiety. So in the paranoid schizoid position, the self feels like threatened and overwhelmed by being attacked from without. And so it feels extremely vulnerable and helpless, right? And the flip side of that is the assumption that the powerful person or party is all powerful, completely in control, 100% rational, right? Is able to achieve its ends. And I think that's interesting because it sort of, to me, exemplifies the basic logic of QAnon, which I will confess to not fully understanding all of the ramifications of the QAnon worldview. But the basic idea, and I think that, I mean, one of the core ideas is that, you know, of course, Donald Trump is engaged in this battle with deep state globalist forces that have taken over the country, and also at the same time with a pedophile ring that's run by liberal elites. So like there's lots of, you know, all the stuff with Jeffrey Epstein has got the QAnon, you know, sort of community like completely like in a whirlwind, right? Trying, you know, thinking about what's going on in the cover up and so on. So what's interesting to me about this conspiracy theory, there's lots of things, but one thing is that it seems to me to kind of idealize Trump's behavior, to assert that he is, like all appearances to the contrary notwithstanding, actually fully in control, not only of himself, but also of the country. So there's this kind of idealization of power that is driving the QAnon conspiracy. Like, it's not like he's just tweeting things erratically, like there's a method to all of it, right? And he's completely in control, and it'll all be revealed someday, and we can follow the little crumbs to sort of get the clues to see what's going to happen. Okay, so those are some thoughts about how the logics of conspiracy theories seem to follow this kind of paranoid schizoid logic and also be driven by conditions of kind of persecutory anxiety. So what then, if this is at all compelling, like what could be done? What insights could we get from psychoanalysis for thinking about it? Well, the point is not that people who believe in conspiracy theories need therapy. I mean, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but that's not my claim. Nor is it that we all do, which is not to say that it wouldn't be beneficial, just to say that that's not my claim either. The claim would be, or the question would be, how to think about whether we could move politics out of something like this paranoid schizoid mode into what Klein called the depressive mode. And I know that doesn't sound great either, because it's like depressive, but the important insight there is that to do politics in a depressive mode would be to be able to tolerate ambiguity, complexity, and ambivalence without resorting to splitting. And so what does that look like? Well, I think there's some really interesting ideas in this recent book by someone I mentioned a few minutes ago, Noelle McAfee. The book's called Fear of Breakdown, Politics and Psychoanalysis. And it's a really interesting argument that brings together very kind of high-level psychoanalytic theory and so on with a lot of theoretical and empirical work on democratic deliberation. So McAfee has not only done a lot of philosophical work on theories of deliberative democracy, but she's also worked through the Kettering Foundation and other places with actual experiments and work in political deliberation. So she has a lot of empirical work to draw on. And I think that her picture, which is very much inspired by Klein, gets at what it might look like to move politics out of a paranoid schizoid mode and into a depressive one. So here's one of her descriptions, very nice, of democratic politics. It calls for growing up, moving beyond the black and white of adolescence and toward a more mature understanding of the complexities and ambiguities in politics, and learning to live with ambivalence and uncertainty. This calls for radically questioning our own preconceptions and points of view, and being willing to discover that the others in our midst, with whom we were so sure were the devil, might possibly have a perspective, maybe even a point we should consider. And so the idea is that moving politics into something like this depressive mode requires a kind of renewed commitment to democratic deliberation, but also a new understanding of democratic deliberation, where the aim of deliberation is not just the exchange of reasons. Not to say that we don't exchange reasons in political deliberation, but that's not the sole point, which is, of course, the way that many, if not most, theorists of deliberative democracy think about the point of political deliberation. It's just about exchanging reasons and trying to convince your interlocutor to accept your reasons, or that, vice versa. And on McAfee's analysis, it is true that exchanging of reasons happens in political deliberations, and not that that's irrelevant, but that the process is really what's beneficial about the process, particularly in our kind of very polarized political moment, is that it can be a process of what she calls working through. And what she means by that, I think, is the point of deliberation is not so much to change the other person's view, but rather, as she says, to change their views of others and of others' views. So in other words, it's to get people to move past this demonization and splitting, right? And to see someone with whom they deeply disagree as a whole person, who holds views they disagree with, but also has reasons and experiences that justify the holding of those views, and that, to accept all that complexity. Now, I think importantly, this doesn't mean withholding judgments about, let's say, the person you're, deliberating with holds racist views or misogynist views or something like that. It doesn't have to mean withholding judgments about the content of those views. What it does mean is trying to understand, not justify, but understand why someone else might hold them. And in that sense, come to a different kind of relationship with your political opponent that is not so polarized. And I think, if we were able to achieve something like that, it would be tremendously beneficial to our current political landscape. So, stop there. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. So how do you see your ideas here related to Hofstadter's famous essay that thinks about paranoia not as a clinical term, but as a style in political discourse?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are connections there for sure. And I mean, I guess the question is, one question would be, is this a kind of the paranoid style endemic to American politics or not, right? Is it possible really to move beyond it? And I think there, I would say it's certainly not easy, and probably never possible to move beyond it in any final way. I mean, I think that's why the language that McAfee uses, the psychoanalytic language of working through, is really important. This is this sort of, has to be an ongoing process, because I think there's a tendency, not just in politics, but in life, to kind of revert to a paranoid schizoid mode. So that's never going to go away. Yeah. I think there could be connections to be drawn. I don't have like super insightful things to say about it, but I think this analysis is like trying to draw on psychoanalysis to kind of, extend something like Hofstadter's view. There's a really great essay that I refer to in the conclusion that this is based on by a political scientist named Robin Marasco, called Toward a Critique of Conspiratorial Reason. And she does that. She sort of starts with Hofstadter and then moves actually to Klein and sort of tries to draw that connection. So I think that's a really fertile connection. Should I call in people?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Oh yeah, please turn it around.
So, how do we get to this point of deliberation?
Yeah.
I mean, you must have thought about, I mean, we're at such polarization now. Is this just a pendulum that has to swing back because of gravity and
Yeah.
the Earth's orbit, or
Oh,
is
no.
there, or what is the way forward?
Yeah. Excellent question. No, I don't think it'll just swing back and forth. I mean, I think would require actual institutional work. I mean, so McAfee draws on, as I said, a lot of empirical work for deliberative forums that different groups like Kettering Foundation and others sponsor. And so the claim that, what the beneficial thing that can come out of deliberation is not so much changing people's minds, but changing their relation to other people is based on the kind of stuff that happens in those deliberative fora. So I think one thing that could be done is trying to build on that work and expand it. Right? But obviously, I mean, a big part of the problem, I have no solution to this, but is the media environment, which is contributing so much to these kind of totally split echo chamber type of views. And so how we break out of that? Yeah, I don't have an answer. I think it would require, very deliberate institutional work starting at the local level to try to create space, for individuals with very different views to engage in processes of deliberation and see that they can, change their way of relating to their neighbors with whom they profoundly disagree through that. So it'd have to start there.
So all politics is local.
Well,
All paranoia is like.
yeah, over here.
So talking about all these present issues that are going on through this analysis, what are some historical roots that you could maybe talk about where this analysis has I guess you could use this analysis on in history?
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
Because this seems pretty recent, but are there things that in history that politics have been different where you could use this analysis and
Yeah.
what are the
Yeah.
times that those have been different, if you can
Yeah, I see the question.
any others.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm glad you're still talking because I don't have an answer for it yet. So keep going. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historian, so one example. There's a really nice recent book by a political scientist, political theorist named David McIver called "Morning in America," Mourning. So it's a play on the famous Reagan quote, and it's actually all about Klein again and political theory, and he has really nice discussions of truth and reconciliation commissions in the American South, in which people kind of came together to try to work through very violent episodes over civil rights era, conflicts in the past. So the example he gives is in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I mean, of course, you probably are all familiar with the more famous example of truth and reconciliation commissions in South Africa. So that might be another kind of place one could look at how that process goes. But yeah, but he does a kind of nice ethnographic analysis of that and tries to show how, at least in that community, there was a kind of a case of people being able to work through this very polarized, and violent past, and come to some kind of reconciliation that acknowledged all of the differences and the disagreements and the violence, but yet created a new kind of political community. So that's one example. I don't have others to offer, but I think it's a good question that I would think more about. Yeah. Yes, here. So
I find it interesting that the depressive mode is kind of what the recommends to go towards.
Yes.
Well, the funny thing is from a leadership standpoint, I was reading a book that was about first-rate madness, and in it basically described how Abraham Lincoln was a pretty good leader because he was depressed most of his life.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I just find it interesting that pointed that out. But my question is more, is that what we kind of actually need, is for leaders to be more sober, judicious, and even like, because that's not usually what is so shown on television. It's always the guy who's smiling,
Optimistic.
Optimistic with a great set of hair. So.
Yeah. Good. Okay, thank you for that question. I mean, depressive here doesn't mean depressed exactly. It does mean maybe more sober and judicious or something like that, but not necessarily depressed. So I wouldn't advocate that. But it's called depressive actually because it's founded for Klein on an experience of loss. And I think that is important, right? That the kind of mature political view is one that is very clear-headed about loss and trade-offs and, right, like that you can't have it all, right? So something has to be given up in order to have a political solution to a problem, and accepting that and moving on. Whereas the kind of more paranoid schizoid mode, which is the idealization, is like, no, we can have it all, we can, right? My view really will solve all these problems or something. And I think the depressive view is a little more realistic about limitations. So in that sense, it's more sober, but not necessarily depressed. So
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe all that reflecting on loss makes you kind of bummed out, but that's not the main meaning of it.
Okay.
Over here.
So, for my doctoral work, I studied loggers in northwestern logging communities, and then that worked into the spotted owl controversy. And that led me into the President Clinton's forest planning process, all of those things. And what really stuck in the craw of people who lost their jobs as a result of the reduction in timber harvest was not just the job reduction, but the fact that what they saw as the elite newspapers confused the interests of the industry with the interests of the workers. And the workers were portrayed in editorial cartoons as being stupid and cutting the last tree on the horizon. And so their status was confused, deliberately confused for political purposes in what they saw as liberal elite newspapers. Fast forward 20 years, my colleagues and I have worked in some of these same communities on other issues, and the spotted owl controversy continues to come up. Rural people have long memories.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that if you're going to get, and it didn't surprise, it surprised me that Trump won, but it didn't surprise me that Trump won these communities. That there was a logical progression from those events to these communities supporting Trump and his what he peddled. It seems to me and then one of the most astute and dumb things at the same time that that Obama ever did was to say these people cling to their guns and their religion. It was absolutely accurate and absolutely stupid thing to say politically, right? So it seems to me that if we're going to make some of the ideas that you're suggesting work in the communities that I'm most familiar with and study, it's going to have to start with the elite admitting that they marginalize people. That it's never going to come from the other end. I mean, these people are still too angry and still feeling oppressed by all these changes going on, and that their culture and their way of life has been, not only has their living been taken away from them, but their way of life has been denigrated.
Yeah.
That if you're going to start a conversation to lead to the depressive state, it's going to have to come from the people that they feel.
Yeah.
Start with apologizing.
Yeah.
Perhaps from the apologies from the people who they feel so wronged by, and yet I don't see it.
I'm not optimistic.
Stepping forward with that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details of the examples you're talking about, but I think I agree. I mean, and it's partly the motivation for this talk is to, that why I started off with saying, well, a lot of critical theorists now going back to psychoanalysis, and it tends to have this effect where people are like, all those people who are authoritarian personalities, and that's why they support Trump. And I don't think I think that's failing to take seriously enough the reasons, failing to approach the other people with a kind of sense of like, you have reasons for your views, you have grievances, we want to know what they are, right? So somehow, I realize, and I'm not sure describing politics as paranoid schizoid is going to sound much better. Maybe the terminology is still a little problematic, but again, I think that the language is useful not for diagnosing individuals who hold particular views, but we're thinking about the logic of our politics, right? it's at that level that terminology is helpful to me, and precisely, yeah, I mean, I think, I'm just saying things that are generally agreeing with you, I think, but, you know, this call for radically questioning our own preconceptions and points of view and being willing to consider that, or discover that the others with whom we were so willing to demonize might possibly have a perspective. I think that's a lesson that the left, if you will, or progressive elites have to learn. Not that we're the only ones who have to learn it, but we need to learn that lesson. Otherwise, I don't think we get anywhere. I totally agree. Oh, so many hands. Can I go here in the back of this way? Yeah.
Could you briefly go back to Klein?
Yeah.
Where Klein, on her slide, the first part of that,
Yeah.
which you didn't do much emphasis for, seems to be kind of an engine. That high depressive anxiety, fear, that seems to be an engine that moves toward, in her theory, that moves toward the other kinds of positions.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see that in the other things you're talking about in terms of the conspiracy theories? Or even for Matt's elite snobs?
Yeah.
How does that, the kind of fear that she's sort of talking about, perform a kind of an engine that moves toward overcoming a splitting, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, in her, you know, kind of developmental story, I'm not sure there's a satisfying answer to your question, because the idea is that at some point, early in the first year of life, the infant comes to recognize the primary caregiver as a whole object, and then this kind of forces a transformation of their position, because they then have to face the fact that, like, the object that they had split into the, you know, all benevolent, wonderful, nourishing object and the evil, destructive, persecutory one is actually the same person. And then they have to, like, develop this kind of more ambivalent relationship to it. So I don't know that there's an analog. I'm not sure there's an answer in Klein's story exactly to your question. It might be something more that we would have to think about how to create space for politically, like how to create space for seeing other people or political views that we really think are abhorrent as somehow, you know, seeing those people to hold them as whole people. How do we do that politically? I'm not so sure. Maybe you know, engaging these kind of deliberative fora is one way to do it. I mean, I think one what's going to make it much harder to do that is the way that the more that persecutory anxiety is heightened, the harder it's going to be to do that. So the more that people are whipping up fears, you know, of immigrants, of globalization, like, that's just going to kind of reinforce the paranoid schizoid logic. So one thing that would help would be, you know, not doing that, right? Like, trying to break up the kind of anxiety, because it's the anxiety kind of feeds this paranoid schizoid cycle, the anxiety of being attacked. And I think, you know, Trump, for example, is really skillful. He's, like, really, really good at doing that. That's obviously not a complete explanation for, like, how he got elected or how he stays in power, but it's a piece of it. I think he's really skillful at exploiting a persecutory anxiety and using that to fuel polarization and to fuel this kind of embattled logic of his supporters.
So you have probably time for one more.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I don't know whose hand was up first. Either one of you? Yeah. Okay. Sure.
So it would seem there's a lot of deliberate misinformation and
Yeah.
kind of a post-truth culture that we're starting to enter now.
Yeah.
That seems to stand directly in the way of meaningful deliberation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not just talking about conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
but just a disregard for facts.
Yeah.
How do we combat that to try to bring ourselves, both sides, left and right, out of this paranoid schizoid position and try to meet someplace in the middle?
Yeah.
When it seems anyone can say anything nowadays and somebody will cling on to it as a fact.
Yeah. God, I wish I knew. I mean, yeah, like, the answer to that question. Did you want to answer it?
No, I just wanted to say I feel like some of it is because of social media, though, because, like,
Yeah.
there's so many things you can say, and there's no, like, you don't have to have, like, a position of, like, knowledge to just, like, make a whole article and then like have everybody like see it on social media
Yeah.
or something, or people don't really have to check that because they just assume
Yeah.
sometimes, and so not becoming part of our world so much today, it's like I think that's like a big contributor to misinformation.
I mean, I also feel like, I don't know, you know, I don't have evidence to back this up, but I feel like, to go back to this question about the loggers, so a lot of that, you know, post-truth, you know, sort of stance is fueled by just basic lack of trust in so-called elites, right? So like the New York Times can fact check, you know, a Trump speech all at once, and you know, for some segment of the population, they're just going to say, "Oh, that's, you know, fake news," you know, and I don't know. I guess the question is like, is it that what's the tail and what's the dog here, right? You know, and it seems to me it's at least possible that, you know, the willingness to label these, you know, formerly trusted media sources as fake news is being fueled by this kind of real felt sense of being looked down upon by the people who run the New York Times, write the New York Times, read the New York Times. I mean, and so if you could somehow work to like get both sides to see each other differently, that might help alleviate some of the problem. I don't think it's not going to do away with it, but it does seem to me at least part of it is just about a basic lack of trust, and then you're talking about the relationship between the groups, not about people's relationship to truth. Does that make sense?
Okay, unfortunately, I think our time is up. Let me remind you again, next week we have 2 events with Stephen Levitsky. Let me thank you all for coming out today, and now join me in thanking Amy for reading.